Hello and good evening, everybody. My name is Vidya Natarajan. I'm a writer and I also run the academic writing program at King's University College in London, Ontario. I want to acknowledge the location I'm sitting in. It's the Museum London, and it stands at the forks of the Dashkan Zibi, the Antler River. And I want to acknowledge the guardianship of its shores for many centuries by the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape-Wauk, and the Atawandaron peoples. On behalf of Josh Lambier and WordsFest, I'm delighted to welcome you to this session on the poetry of Memoir, featuring Lorna Crozier and Madhur Anand. An officer of the Order of Canada, Lorna Crozier has been acknowledged for her contributions to Canadian literature, her teaching, and her mentoring, with 5 honorary doctorates. Her books have received many national awards, including the Governor General's Award for Poetry. A professor emerita at the University of Victoria, she has performed for Queen Elizabeth II and has read her poetry, which has been translated into several languages, on every continent except Antarctica. Her book, What the Soul Doesn't Want, was nominated for the 2017 Governor General's Award for Poetry. In 2018, Lorna received the George Woodcock Lifetime Achievement Award. She lives on Vancouver Island. Stephen Price called Through the Garden a love story with cats, which Lorna will be talking about today, one of the great love stories of our time. This is a memoir about 2 years during which Lorna's beloved husband, the celebrated author Patrick Lane, was seriously ill. Patrick Lane passed away in March 2019. We're also going to hear from Madhur Anand, the author of A New Index for Predicting Catastrophes and other literary works published in national and international literary magazines. At the University of Guelph, Madhur is a full professor of ecology and sustainability and the inaugural director of the Guelph Institute for Environmental Research. Today, she will be talking about her memoir, published this year. This red line goes straight to your heart, starts with the turmoil of the partition of India, when a red line on a map divided India from Pakistan. This memoir traces the story of an Indian-Canadian family deeply affected by that political and human catastrophe, but also transformed by emigration and, in the second generation, by a bicultural upbringing. Lorna and Madhur, it's great to have you here this evening. We will begin with each of you reading from your memoirs for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to ask if Lorna will go first. And I do have plenty of questions I want to ask both of you, but I'm also going to talk to the attendees for a second. Everyone who's here attending, could you please set your chat function to panelists and attendees instead of just to panelists, and type in questions and comments as you see fit. So I'm going to hand it over to Lorna.
Thank you, Vidya, and it's wonderful to be here with Madhur and with you for this London festival. I feel honored to have been invited. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wasanich people, right next to the village of Palquichin. And I'll read a short section from my book called Through the Garden, a love story with cats. When I visit the hospital, I don't bring diversions. Unlike the woman in Patrick's first room who sat by her husband and worked on puzzles in a crossword book, the kind you find near the cash register in grocery stores. Although we've played crib in the past, for some reason I've resisted arriving with a crib board and a deck of cards. It would seem a fake solace, and more than that, a surrendering, an acceptance that he's going to be here a long time, trapped in the prison of his body, bored, querulous, a life sentence, a death sentence, hanging over his head. A couple of friends have dropped off books, ones I wouldn't mind taking home and dipping into. Patrick hasn't opened them. He's too confused and ill to follow another writer's characters or plot, so I've decided to read out loud from his new novel, Deep River Night. In now what seems like a miracle, at least a miracle of dedication and belief in one's vocation, Patrick, wired on a steroid to treat his mysterious disease, worked on his next to last draft after his bout in the hospital last February. Though he suffered from cognitive confusion and his brain, in his words, has felt like a heavy, wet towel. He needed to do a final editing that included writing an opening chapter. Confronted by this advice from this editor, he said, I'm going to send back the advance and tell them I can't do it. You can delay this, I said. You're the boss, not the publisher. Just leave it for a few weeks and see how you feel. His editor pushed him by making him feel guilty for even considering giving up and by believing in the beauty of the writing on the pages she received. I've already spent 100 hours on this, she said. It's too brilliant to stop now. I felt so grateful she was able to convince him to finish the book when I couldn't. I watched him, released from the hospital, but not his illness, day after day, go into his office and hunch over his computer. I never asked how it was going. I never asked to read a word. My interest, my interference could have shattered everything. Now the book is in my hands. The writing so gorgeous, the diction so rich. As I read to him out loud, I have to force myself to keep moving from sentence to sentence rather than stopping and exclaiming in wonder and praise. God, this man can craft a word, a phrase, a paragraph, a chapter, a book. And the pages shine with the kind of hard-won wisdom that can come only from a writer with over 7 decades behind him. How does this person I live with, who appears so ordinary in our daily lives, as he shops for groceries, does the laundry, cleans the litter box, clips the perennials in the garden, tames the cat, how does he see so clearly? How does he know so much? It seems to relax him, my reading of his words, and I peer over the cover of his novel and watch his face, so dear to me, on the standard faded blue hospital pillow. His eyes flutter underneath his closed eyelids as if he were re-envisioning image after image on the page, the things he saw in his inner mind and jigged into language. The dark cup of the cat's ear moved, the long guard hairs at the tip shivering toward the crack in the window beside her. Art finished his drink, put his glass down by the whiskey bottle, and waited to see if the cat's ear would come back to rest. But it didn't. His words curl off my tongue with exquisite, demanding exactitude, each a tribute to the courtesy and attention he affords to the things around him, the working men and women he grew up with, the hardness of the life, and the various creatures that populate his rich and teeming imaginations, in this case, a cat. The only thing that brings me as much pleasure is curling up beside him on top of the thin bedspread, my head resting on his shoulder, my top leg swung over his. I've taken off the gloves and mask, hoping I won't get caught by the staff and upbraided. This is the best part, he says. I close my eyes until the nurse comes into the room with his medication for the night. She seems bemused, to see two old people snuggled together among the tubes and monitors that register his blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen level. There's nothing amorous about this room. It is the epitome of anti-romance. But the bed is the same size as the one where we spent our first nights together when Patrick moved into my room at the Summer School of the Arts and the old TB sanitarium in Fort Qu'Appelle, Saskatchewan. For a moment, I wonder if the tuberculosis virus that attacked so many had lurked in the corners of those old corridors of patients' rooms and crawled into his nose or mouth. Did it lie in wait in his bloodstream and decades later overrun the country of his body? It can't be. It's just coincidence that the bed feels the same, so different from the queen-sized we sleep in at home. I'm amazed the narrow hospital cot feels just the right width as I nestle next to him, as if in his sickness we've both become smaller. When everything else is gone, will this diminished, worn out thing we are together be all that will remain? There's a sweetness in this and a sadness and something I can't put my finger on. Everything between us is stretched thin and fragile as an old person's skin. Everything bruises. We've both pondered which one of us will have to help the other out of this life. Which one of us will be left alone? I don't want to be the one abandoned. And I know he doesn't want that too. The 9 years difference in our ages didn't mean anything when we met. It means something now. I'm more than likely to be the caregiver, the one left behind, the one who has to walk miles and miles through staggering grief, carrying an unbearable emptiness on my back.
Lorna, that was so powerful. I have a comment from Alan Anderson. He says, "Oh, the joy of being with those who love poetry." And Taslima Jafar says, "I could listen to Lorna all day." And I think the same thing. I could listen to you all day. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
May I ask Madhur to read from this red line?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor, pleasure to be here with you in London and with Lorna. I will read you two very, very short pieces. One from this side of the book, which is probably the one that most people will start with, although you can start either way. And it's the very first entry. It's in my mother's voice, so the I is my mother. Entitled Opditi versus Jagditi. The story goes more or less like this. A nobleman is out hunting with his hawk. The hawk gets him a crane, which he throws into a bag to bring back to his villa to have cooked for his dinner. The nobleman's cook has a friend who, unable to resist the smell of the cooking bird, begs the cook to give him one of the crane's legs each. When the nobleman sees the cooked crane with the missing leg on his plate, he asks the cook about it. The cook insists that the crane had only one leg to begin with. The cook tries to prove his point by taking the nobleman back to the river where the crane was hunted. They come upon a number of cranes in the water, standing on one leg, asleep. The cook says, "See, they all have only one leg." The nobleman yells, "Shoo!" and the cranes put down their second legs and fly away. The nobleman folds the cook, but the cook then asks the nobleman, Why did you not yell shoo at the dinner table earlier today? How do you know for sure that the cooked crane would not also reveal its second leg to you then? You see, you have wasted my time, sir. The nobleman accepts the cook's wit in exchange for his forgiveness. So, before I continue, um, I'm getting a note from a viewer in the next room in my house that the sound is muffled. Are you feeling that?
Yes, I think we've had a few comments that say the sound is muffled. Is there anything we can do about it from your end, Madhur?
I'm not sure. It was fine when we did the test. Um, oh, did it? Yeah. So I should just get closer? Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Is this a little bit better?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay,
definitely.
so I'll just be really, really close. I'll just ring in your ear. Okay. I'll just finish that section, okay? I have never heard of Giovanni Boccaccio, the man who wrote this story entitled A Witty Answer, which I read in um, okay, just sorry. If you, I may actually use headphones. So if you just give me 1 second, I think I'm going to get the headphones. It was totally fine in the test, but it's worth it to give you a second here.
Oh, the perils of technology. I think we've all become good at doing this Zoom thing, but you can't always have it perfect.
Yeah.
And it's great that Mother's kind of bringing her headphones in. Lorna, there's so much response to what you've written. People are crying all over Canada. And some in Michigan too, I believe.
Is this any better,
Yes.
folks? Okay. All right. I don't know how much of it you could actually hear previously, so I may just skip to the next piece, if that's okay with everybody. So I'll go flip to the other side, and I'm going to read a short piece entitled "The Theorem of Friends and Strangers." Let me tell you something that is true, but you will not believe it. Take any group of 6 people, say at a party. If you pick 3 within that group, they will turn out to be either mutual friends or mutual strangers. Another. In any big city, New Delhi, let me say, or no, let me say Toronto, there must be at least 2 people with the same number of hairs on their heads. Another. Mark 5 dots randomly on a piece of paper, and it will result in at least 4 of them being able to trace a 4-sided figure. Ramsay's theory, the larger theory to which the theorem of friends and strangers belongs, allows us to find structure in apparently random sets. Partition regularity, more specifically, allows us to take a set, partition it into some finite number of pieces, and then try to say as much as possible about those pieces. I have hundreds of pieces, fragments of thoughts. I want to say as much as possible with them. I want to find some application of Ramsay's theory for that, so that everyone in the subset is either a friend or a stranger. I want to find that person in New Delhi who has the same number of hairs on their head as me. I want to match every feeling in one partition with its mirror image in the second. I want to trace that 4-sided figure, a country's border, drawn by connecting a number of arbitrary dots, the past meeting the future.
Thank you, Madhur. That was amazing. Do you want to read another small passage from your mother's part of the narrative?
Um, well, I don't. Okay, thanks. I hate to not include my mother here. So this is the side that's told in the alternating voices of my parents. So I told you the story about the hawk and crane. That was a story actually taken from the Decameron. And my mother voice comes in at this point. She says, I have never heard of Giovanni Boccaccio, the man who wrote this story entitled A Witty Answer, which I read in my radiant reading book in Dehradun when I was 16. It is full of words I did not know: trust, refusal, obliged, wrath, impudence. The truth is, 3 of 5 of these words I still do not know. The story is one of 100 tales from a book called The Decameron, set in Florence in 1350. It was the time of the Black Death, my daughter tells me. I have a vague idea of where Italy is now, because my daughter took me there when I was already an old woman. It was Venice, and she made me taste red wine for the second time in my life and listen to a classical concert of Mozart in a very old church. I listened, but I did not like it. I tried to hide that fact from my daughter, but she saw me asleep. I said it was from wine, but she knew I had only had 3 sips. I still do not know what the Black Death is, but it sounds worse than partition. Excuse me, do you want to hear Apiti or Jagbiti? My version or the version written by others?
That's a beautiful passage. Thank you, Madhur. So I'm going to start asking a few questions, and then we'll take questions from the attendees as well. In your memoirs, both of you walk that very delicate line between privacy and self-disclosure with a great deal of expertise. How did you make decisions about what to reveal and what to hold back? I'm going to ask Lorna to respond first, and then Madhur.
In the writing of this memoir, just as in the writing of the poetry that I've been involved with for over 50 years, I never think about what I should or shouldn't say um, when I start the process, when I start putting words on my screen or on the page. Otherwise, I'd have a censor on my shoulder and I would be afraid to say anything. So I have to let all of that go. And it's only when I consider publishing, when I'm ready to send it out, that I start to wonder, do I have the right to say this? Will I hurt someone if I include this passage in my book? And would it be the more ethical, a more moral thing to leave that section out? So in the writing of this book, I was able to read to Patrick the parts about our past together. The book is not only about his illness, the part that you heard me read tonight, but I also decided to revisit how we met, some of the adventures we shared together, and the characters of the 5 cats who lived with us over 4 decades. I was able to read the passages about our early years and the passages about the cats to him, and he took great delight in them. He sometimes would remember things differently and say, I don't know that you got that quite right, or I think this happened, but not that. And we'd laugh about it, and I would decide whether to make changes or not. I didn't read him the parts about his illness because they were too heartbreaking. And I knew that he was carrying enough of a burden as it was, just trying to find the bravery to get through every day. And I didn't want to share so openly how distraught and terrified I was, because I didn't think he needed that to carry with him. So in this book, I am as honest as I can be, but I did leave out some things that I thought were better left on the editing room floor. A couple of passages about his adult children that I didn't think needed to be in there. But for the most part, I just let my own sense of what needed to be said and what needed to be said with grace to remain, and hope that I made the right decisions most of the time.
Lorna, you evoke such a tender and beautiful scene, two poets sitting together and reminiscing using the words that they had written, one of them had written. I'm going to ask Madhur this question. Madhur, there's a kind of interesting overlap with what Lorna said about fact checking, because you did that and you found that some of the things you had heard from your father were actually not accurate. Do you want to comment on that personal disclosure versus uh, reticence point?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was something I thought about a lot. I think I worried about more than actually ended up being a problem in a sense, because I really do feel that uh, the writing of the book and the lenses and the approach I took, which was really motivated by the desire for understanding and discovery, um, somehow dictated in the end what felt like would be too much or not necessary, or um, not reflecting the ethic of what it was that I was trying to write. Um, because there's all kinds of memoirs, and mine is a little bit different. It's an experimental memoir. It's half biography, half autobiography. It doesn't follow a clear linear pathway. It doesn't attempt to encapsulate or summarize someone's life. Um, and I was dealing with quite a lot of territory. So my memoir traces the lives of my parents from childhood in pre-partition India in the 40s to present, and they're still alive. And so uh, these stories I told were ones that I had been hearing all my life. They were ones that my parents voluntarily told me. But one thing I found was that I made a decision early on, again, partly dictated by my approach, which was that I wasn't interested in sort of finding a single truth or making a judgment or resolving something. I let my father speak for himself. I let my mother speak for herself, and I spoke for myself. And then I brought all three narratives together through the lenses of poetry and science.
Thank you, Madhur. So just so people understand where that comes from, I'm just going to hold up your book in a minute. I'm going to sort of focus in on the same question, but not so much from the point of self-disclosure as from the point of a view of maybe bringing other people into the limelight who may or may not want to. You've already touched on that. I want to extend that point a little bit. So a memoir is challenging to write, obviously, because you can't be completely solipsistic. You have to describe the lives and personalities and strengths and sometimes the frailties of all the other people that your lives are entangled with. So Madhur, in this red line, you make this really brilliant and daring move of writing three memoirs in effect, with your parents narrating their stories alongside yours. So you use their voices, as you said. So for the people attending out there, the book is in two parts, and they meet in the middle. So you can start reading from here, which is Madhur's own narrative, and you can also start reading from here, this way, and the two narratives kind of collide in the middle. You present your parents' stories without judgment and with deep sympathy, and I get what you're saying about not wanting to fact check in an obtrusive way. So you allow them to say tell their stories. There are certain parts of the story where I think some of your sympathy for one or the other of your parents sort of seeps through. Do you want to comment on any of those parts?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think I don't know if I would say sympathy, but certainly what I aimed for was empathy. and maybe for readers who or listeners here who are unaware of what these stories are about, I mean, it's stories of having to leave your childhood home during the partition of India. It's the story of their arranged marriage and the difficulties that ensued after that, because they came from very different backgrounds. It's the story of emigration to Canada, and my father coming over for a year at first alone and spending a year in Montreal as a new immigrant in the late 60s. My mother staying behind and living with her in-laws and so on. And so, you know, the types of difficulties are there's quite they're quite traumatic circumstances, but there's also just the hardships of going to new places and trying to make a life from nothing. And also in my father's case, there is a story of his childhood polio. So he did, and so all of those things are things that I tried to, you know, write with empathy, but also I did not want to be the observer. I mean, I really wanted to get into their shoes, and I did get into their shoes and their clothes and so on. And I used their voices, and I told their stories, but I also used their voices. So I mean, when you read it, I think you will hear their voices in various ways. For example, I used some of the diction of my mother. If my mother makes grammatical mistakes, which she still does because she has a very heavy Indian accent still, I kept those sometimes. I would use the original language that they would often pepper with their stories, Hindi and Punjabi. And so I really wanted to kind of you know, tell their stories in their voices, but at the same time, since I was taking that bold step of telling them for them, and using the first person, I wanted to be honest with the reader as well in terms of where I was coming from, and which you know, has to do with a whole lifetime of training as a scientist and a poet.
May I ask something here, Madhur? I just find this so daring and brave, the approach that you took. And did you say to your parents, can I hear that story again about such and such? And then you listened with your sharp scientist and poet's ear to get the words down. Did you take notes while they were talking? Did you record them? Or is this just because these are stories repeated so often that they've become part of you and you retold them?
Yeah, I did take a kind of very, well, I recorded them. I sort of, at some point when I realized the project that I was undertaking, I did it more just for practical purposes, you know, because there was a lot of things I couldn't just make notes on. And I also did it because I absolutely wanted to immerse myself in their voices. And that was the only way to do it, was to listen and re-listen to the way they were telling the stories. Yeah.
There's a comment from one of the attendees, and it says, I think it's Pen Kemp, and she says she loves how you allowed all these different voices to speak for themselves. Lorna, your memoir cannot but portray the life and work and character of your late husband, Patrick Lane. So closely intertwined were your lives. But for all that exquisite and heart-wrenching tenderness in your narrative, you do present him from the point of view of an observer rather than from within his self. So in that, your memoir is a bit of a contrast to Madhur's. She gets into her parents' clothes and skin, as she says, whereas you present Patrick as someone from the outside. You tell the reader what he told you, what you guessed, what you sensed, what you noticed, what you speculated sometimes. There's a wistful note in the second half of Through the Garden, as if his illness had underlined that you did not actually inhabit the same body. Can you tell us about this tension between identifying with and being separate from Patrick?
Oh, yeah. I wanted the book to be, or the book is about, a long and loving relationship. So we were together from 1978 until his death in 2019. So 4 decades. And so we were close, we were loving, we were bickering and unruly and crazy and sometimes drunken and always poets and always challenging one another, never letting the other one sink into complacency or narrow-mindedness, always on each other's case, which I think is one of the things that made us want to stay together. I think we made each other bigger and better people. Neither of us wanted to live in the shadow of another person either. And for me, that meant when we got together that I was very feisty. I had to insist on my own strength, living with this larger than life man who was already a literary figure when we got together. And I wasn't. I was merely a promising writer. So we knew each other, I think, as well as you can know another human being. But that means there were so many countries of each other that we did not explore or were able to explore, or that were cut off from one another either deliberately or just the way it is. You rub against another human being and you think you know them, but there are realms that you don't know. That I think is exciting, but it's also frustrating and in some ways sad. And I think one of the sad things for me was that Patrick did not let me know that he knew he was dying. To protect me, he said, all will be well. All will be well. All manner of things will be well, quoting Julia of Norwich. And then later, when I was clearing up his computer, I saw an email he'd sent to a friend where he said, I can taste death in my mouth. And for a moment, I felt angry and left out that he wasn't able to tell me that. Now, I don't feel that way. I realize it was out of love for me that he kept that to himself. So I couldn't write in his voice. I could only write in my voice to try to capture him in words in the pages of this book, both the last few years of his life when he was so sick and all the wonderful years we spent together when he was healthy and very much alive.
That was such a kind thing for Patrick to do, such a loving thing. And I see why you are moved by that, even now as you think back on it. I'm just going to segue away from content for a minute to structure. I'm always dazzled by experiments with nonlinearity, and I'd love to hear a bit about the structure of your memoirs. Lorna, would you like a minute to compose yourself? Or may I ask you the first question?
Sure. I go back and forth between tears and laughter. That's a wonderful title of an early Alden Nolan book of poetry, for those who don't know it, one of our country's finest poets.
And I think everyone listening here is amazed by your courage and your ability to be vulnerable for a minute. May I just add a little bit to my question, just so people know what I mean? That you give your readers a timeline when you have chapter headings that have dates on them, and the timeline keeps the reader anchored to that 2-year period between 2017 and 2019. But within each chapter, your narrative ranges from your childhood to your teenage years to your courtship, Patrick's and your courtship, and then your midlife and your present. So those contrasts and the changes that occur between these moments are incredibly poignant. Did you plot the memoir deliberately? How do you generally approach structure? And does this have anything to do with gardens, Japanese or otherwise?
Right. Um, I approach the writing of this book the way I approach the writing of a poem, and that is I don't know where I'm going or how I'm going to get there. I just go with whatever is pulling me forward in terms of language and rhythm and music and metaphor and image. And so I just intuitively started to merge times, to write about Patrick in the hospital and then place myself in the garden maybe 3 months earlier, and then swing back to 20 years ago, and then swing back to 40, and then the present, and then me phoning 911 for him to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance for the fourth time that year, or was it the fifth time that year? All those times seem to swirl together. And I write about time. There's a small section philosophizing about time in the memoir. I think looking back, I did this mixing unconsciously because when you live with illness, something odd happens to time. You no longer know how long a person has been ill. Um, when were they last laughing in an exuberant and cheerful way? When is the next doctor's appointment? It all seems to melt, and you think of those Salvador Dali watches, pocket watches, and also you're sort of on a sluggish river in a raft, being taken somewhere. You don't know when or where, but you just have to be there together, hanging on for dear life before one of you gets knocked off into the water. Um, I remember again, after I wrote the memoir, I ran into a quotation by Eudora Welty, which I just loved and which I thought kind of summed up what I tried to do in terms of structure. She says that things unfold in our lives in a sequential order, like we're speaking tonight. And after, this session ends, I'm going to go have a glass of wine and have some dinner. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to get up and go for my walk. And so one day, one moment after the other, but the way they happen in our memory and probably in art when we're reconstructing them is through their significance and through the thread of revelation that they supply to us. So I think I tried to follow a thread of revelation, and that warped time and dropped me in the past or pulled me into the present, recent present, past present, all that kind of stuff just merged. And it felt like the right thing to do. It felt like the way we live. So often when we think we are being present, we're not. We're actually living in our minds, in reliving an event that happened 10 years ago, and it has as much sharpness and significance as what we're doing and saying now. Um, the garden, I guess, provided me with a seasonal chronology, which I thought helped pin down all the other leaping that I was doing in the book. So I think that's what the garden gave me, was a seasonal basis. And my editor helped me put those headings in there so that this swirl of time could have at least some small logic for a reader, some bookmarks for them to follow through the journey I wanted them to take with me.
That's an absolutely amazing explanation. I love that phrase you used, the thread of revelation. And I hope it was also a thread of consolation sometimes to feel that going back and recollecting happier times was a way of saying to yourself that all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well.
In a way, I wrote the book more to find courage than to be consoled, because I started it in the middle of Patrick's illness, and I didn't know how I was going to survive, how I was going to go on, how I was going to be a loving caregiver and still hold something of myself to myself. I didn't know whether I was going to have to give up writing in order to be the person he needed in all those moments. So more than consolation, it gave me courage. And I think it was my way of writing on the wall of time, we were here. I think that's probably the main reason I wrote it.
Wow, that's wonderful. Madhur, your parents' story and yours, as we noted, meet in the middle. So they start at different moments in time. And literally, even in the material fact of the book's pagination and so on. So, this is a spectacular metaphor for converging and diverging fractal narratives. You look at the similarity and the divergence, and for those tensions between familial and cultural cohesion on the one hand, and individual and political and epistemic partitions on the other. So, the word partition is really important as a metaphor. What made you choose this experimental structure, and how do you work on the design of your books? If you are planning one, for example, what would you do?
Um, this book was not planned. The design was not planned from the outset this way at all. My original ambition was to write down my parents' stories. That they were here stories. It started with my mother having a heart attack in 2015, and me realizing for the first time that she could die without me knowing many things about her life. I had heard stories, but there were so many things I didn't know. And I also realized at that point that every individual who dies of that generation now, who has this living memory of partition, we will lose that entire memory, that collective memory of that, because there are very few memoirs and biographies written of individuals who lived through those times. It was generally something that wasn't talked about very much. Or it's passed down through oral histories, which is a wonderful form, but can be lost completely in one generation. It's a very fragile form, especially when families move and migrate and cultures are partitioned. So that's what started it, and it was a really fast. There's a progression in time. There's a definitely, it's not quite linear because it's quite jumpy, because I wanted to respect the stories that my parents wanted to tell me. And so there isn't always a perfect matching up of he said, she said. There certainly isn't that structure at all. But it was things that my father wanted to tell me of his time, and that my mother wanted to tell me of her time. And but it does sort of cover a certain linear trajectory that we moved through really quickly because I had a lot to get through. So that first half of the book is perhaps will read a little bit more linearly for the reader, but then when you have to flip it over to get to my side, which is it's of my life, which is much shorter in terms of the duration. It does start in my childhood, but you know, in the 70s, not in the 40s, and so and because of who I am, my side I think reads a lot more turbulently, and there was a certain structure that I call turbulent flow, which is the sort of metaphor that I was using in that writing style. But I wouldn't say I forced it. It actually emerged. It merged from the writing process.
That's fascinating. And I think also you have not only used your own language and your parents' voices and so on, but you've also quilted into what you have written a whole range of other textual references. Both your memoirs ended up doing that. I think you had a lot of what a literary reader would call intertextuality in your writing. So, Madhur, your memoir quilts in all these passages from things like the Yajnavalkya Upanishad to Schrodinger to Kabir's Dohas to your mother's craft school graduation certificate. Why did you use these sources, and how do you think they thicken out your own narrative?
Yeah, I used them to fill in gaps as much as possible, because the process was largely one of discovery for me. It was one of yeah, discovery. And so I used them to contextualize the stories that my parents were telling, because those things were part of their culture. The you know, the Vedas and the Kama Sutra and the Bhagavad Gita were things that um, were part of that culture, and so, and that I was familiar with. But so, for example, you know, when I tell the story of when my grandfather died, my father's father, um, and my father's response to it, because he was living in Toronto at the time and he couldn't be there. Um, you know, I went deeply into the religious procedures and processes of how, you know, Hindus honor, and the rituals that one undertakes after that happens. And similarly, for when I'm describing the arranged marriage of my parents, I use texts from the Kama Sutra, which, contrary to perhaps um, Western popular pop culture, is not just those diagrams of but rather is a huge treatise on relationships, and on marriage and gender, and gender roles, and so on. And so I use, and can, you know, sort of dictates. It really informs the arranged marriage process, actually. So yeah, so that's why I used those for their side. The scientific texts are also woven throughout their side and my side. Partly it was because I wanted to expand and amplify the side of my father, who is a physicist. He did study physics in India. He got a master's degree and worked really, really hard to get there. Came to Canada with the intention and to do a PhD, and then left it. So he never did do his PhD, but he, to this day, but he kept all of his physics books, even from India, and it was a part of him to this day, and he still reads from them. So I learned. So I wanted to use those texts to also contextualize. And he was a physics teacher, so it was a very big part of his life. And you know, because I am both a scientist and a poet and writer, I'm often, you know, require myself to partition those parts of my own identity and those parts of my life. I'm always kind of trying to find ways to bring them back together. And so I wanted to do that for his life as well. That he didn't have to have these partitioned roles. Mm-hmm. And you know, ways of knowing and ways of living.
And I'm going to ask Lorna if she was similarly tearing down partitions between prose and poetry when she brings in so much. Lorna, you bring in a lot of your poetry into this memoir. Do you want to comment on it?
Yeah, the third character in the book. Yeah, I mean, there's Patrick, there's me, and then there's poetry. I see it as as big a force as the two people who occupy most of the pages, because we met through poetry. I attended a workshop by the poet Patrick Lane in 1976. I knew nothing about him except his poems. And so I went there out of love for his poetry and fell in love with the man. 2 years later, we got together. We traveled all over Canada as writers in residence. During our first 15 years together as poets in residence, we taught poetry. We talked about how to teach poetry. Can poetry be taught? We showed each other our poems and edited them. We were each other's first editors. So it just made sense to me to punctuate the prose with poetry. I saw them, first of all, as punctuations, but then I was interviewed by Catherine Graham at the Toronto Library virtual interview, and she said she thought the poems acted as portals. And I thought that was quite a lovely metaphor, and I hope they do function in that way. They are not summations of what happened in, say, the 10 pages of prose before they occur, but they're just another vehicle to take you to a place of of emotion and thought and insight, I hope.
You're just amazing, Lorna. Every time you open your mouth, another metaphor comes out. I don't know how you do it.
Thank you.
So, Lorna, this question is for you. When I opened your memoir and looked at the title, the bit about a memoir that involved cats got me hooked completely. So they're obviously important to the story. How is Poe doing, Po Chui?
So our last cat is we named after the Chinese sage and poet Po Chui, who is male. We should have called her Lady Po Chui, but we've shortened her name to mainly Po now, or Po Chu. She was feral when we brought her home, 8 months old. It was obvious that she'd had a litter of kittens that had starved to death, probably because she was just a pile of bones with a cat pelt draped over top of her. And Patrick tamed her. She would slash and bite and hiss, and he would pick her up and hold her in his arms and say, "Poe, you are such a fine cat. We love you. It's going to be okay, Poe." And he'd hold her tight so she couldn't scratch him or bite. And eventually, she sat beside him on a chair where he always sat. He didn't have to snatch her and hold her to pet her. But I was scared of her. I was afraid to touch her because she had clawed her way up my arm, several times and had bitten me. Um, when he was so ill, I said to him, "This is the cat you're going to leave me with, is Poe, who I'm afraid to pick up to take to the vet, who I can't comb because she won't let me, and she's a long-haired tortoiseshell, so she gets gnats." But since his death, and it's been about a year and a half, she has become my stalwart companion. She follows me through the garden. She comes and gets me in the middle of the afternoon and makes this little squeaking sound, which is the only meow she can make. And I say, "What do you want, Poe? Do you want me to lie down with you?" And I follow her into the bedroom, lie on the bed. She leaps up, cuddles me, and purrs. I drape my arm across her. So I think Patrick said after he died, "Poe, you're what Lorna has left. You have to be a better cat. You have to take care of her." And she's doing it. I absolutely adore her now. I can't imagine coming home to the house without a creature in it. And that creature for me is Poe. Anatole France said that until you love an animal, part of your soul remains unawakened. And I sincerely believe in that. I think animals of all kinds, dogs, cats, birds, fish, turtles, awaken our souls in a way that a relationship with simply another human being doesn't. I also think that cats come closest to poetry as any animal except birds. They're a lyric poem that's muscled and that has four legs and that can walk. So I'm thrilled to have this feline companion with me for as long as she can be here.
That's an adorable story. I wish you many, many long, happy cuddles with Poe.
Thank you.
We've now come to, we're at 8 p.m. Right now. We've had an hour of conversation, which I'm absolutely thrilled by. And I'm wondering if people out there among the attendees would like to add questions that are focused and that I can pass on to you. So participants and attendees, please post any questions you have that I can read out to Lorna and Madhur.
I want to thank people so far for their comments. I haven't been able to read them all because it's a bit distracting, but thank you for this way of engaging with us.
While we're waiting, I'm just going to read a couple of the comments. Margaret Lonsdale says, I found the poetry as almost paintings, places to pause, gaze, and in a way allow us time to contemplate the rest of the text. Poems were bridges for me to pause with, then to cross into whatever pathway you choose to reveal along the trail. I'm now going to read out a couple of questions. Did you feel that writing this has helped you deal with your grief? I'm having a hard time with the death of our son, but wonder if writing about it will help me. This is from Val, and it's for you, Lorna.
Oh, Val, I'm very sorry to hear about that. Um, the wonderful Canadian writer Anne Michael said that she is both a writer and a reader in order to hold another human being close. And I think that's what writing this book did for me. And it's certainly how I feel when I read something, when I discover someone else's story that also manages to speak my story, even though I may come from a different place, be a different gender, be a different race, whatever. There is that thread of humanity, of the emotions that we all go through, that when I read about it on a page in someone else's words, I feel less alone and I feel seen and engaged and a little bit comforted. I don't know if there ultimately is any comfort for the loss of a loved one, but maybe what keeps me going is knowing that other people walk the same path as I have walked and am walking. And maybe we're holding hands. We can't make each other happy, but we can make each other feel less alone in the world.
That's such a powerful response, Lorna. Judith has a question about reticence or revelation. If the adult children had been your own children, would you have left those parts out? She wants to know, Lorna.
If the adult children had been my children. The parts I left out, Patrick had 5 children. We had none. He had 3 children from his first marriage, got married when he was 18. His girlfriend was pregnant in grade 12. I am close to the 2 younger sons who had a different mother, and they live in Victoria, and they have 3 kids each. So I'm called grandma. I have grandchildren without having had children. The part I left out was about the older children because they had such a troubled relationship with their father and were still full of anger. And I didn't like their behavior at the end of his life. But I thought, you know what, they're not important to the story. And I couldn't have written about them with any fairness unless I'd written a lot of words and tried to see their side, their perspective more than I was able to. So I left them out for that reason. Probably if they'd been my children, I would have had different feelings, maybe different insights, but that wasn't the case.
Thank you, Lorna. A question for Madhur. I'm actually going to combine 2 questions, one from Lisa and one from Jennifer. They're both asking about melding poetry and prose together. So why did each of you, and Lorna, I'll ask Madhur to respond first, and then you could respond as well. Why did each of the authors choose to tell these stories in memoir or prose form rather than poetry? And Jennifer says, I would love to hear about the crossing of poetry and memoir, since I'm thinking of including poetry in a memoir. Madhur?
I think I'd maybe start by saying that, there's still so much that needs to be told. And so there's nothing stopping me from writing poems about anything that's in the book now. However, I did try initially to treat some of these ideas as poems. And it just wasn't working. I found that I would try to write a poem and it wasn't working. And then suddenly one day I just, because I had only been a poet, I've published 1 book of poetry, and this is my first work of prose. So it was sort of natural for me to try poetry first for this. But I started to one day just look at some of these poems that I had written, and um, like this, it was like this revelation of, oh my God, I can just unwrap the lines and it's a sentence. uh, huh, sentences, what are those? And so that's basically what started it. And then, of course, because of the sheer volume of the narrative that was involved on my parents' side, especially. Having said that, when and if you read it, you'll see it's quite poetic prose. So I never really, I don't really see the sharp division there. And in fact, there are some pieces on my side of the book that are prose poems. They are there are three pieces that are meditations. So there's meditations on probability, meditations on a virus, meditations on asymmetry, and those are all written as I would say they're poems. Um, so in my case, there isn't a kind of sharp division between the two genres so far.
Thank you. Lorna, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dur has said. I think my memoir is probably a lyrical memoir as well. I wrote it sentence by sentence. I went back through every sentence, read it out loud the way I would a line in a poem to make sure that the rhythm was a pleasing rhythm. The music reflected the content and vice versa. It's image laden, it's metaphorically rich, I hope. And like I said, I use the same techniques. Start writing and see where it takes you. Just ride the writing until it reaches where it wants to be. So I didn't see that there to be that much of a distinction between the prose and the poetry, but the prose certainly gives you more room. And I think allows for more discursiveness, maybe more breaking down of linearity of the time barriers when you're trying to tell a story, and they allow for more narrative. The prose allows for more narrative than lyrical poems do, certainly. I wrote after Patrick died and I had finished editing this book, I started to write poems again, and they were poems about his death. My book ends with Patrick being alive, and us still having hope that the doctors were going to be able to find a diagnosis and an effective treatment. And my publisher and editor twisted my arm to write a postscript, just a page and a half, where I talk about his death as briefly as I could. But I wanted the book to end with him being alive. But what I've written since his death has been, I've gone back to poetry, and some of them are very small. I think they're small utterances, which is where I'm at right now, because the sadness is unlinguistic. It's pre-linguistic. It's not even a howl. It's a stuttering in to try to find a word that says anything about the pain and the bereftness. And poetry, the small capsule of poetry, seems to be the best container for that. Whereas the memoir covers 40 years. So that's the difference, I think.
I think between the use of poetry and the use of prose, you both cover an extraordinary amount of range, emotionally and formally. So aesthetically, I think you offer the reader an experience that either pure poetry or pure prose couldn't possibly have achieved. I have a couple of questions for Madhur again. Madhur, I think this is from Karen, and this is kind of related to another question from Ellen. I'm going to read Ellen's first. How can I get my mother's diction back in my mind? She's been dead a long time, she says. So it's a question about recollection. And Karen has a question about the idea of speaking in someone else's voice. She says, when I started writing about my mother-in-law, someone used the words ghostwriter to describe what I was doing. I didn't really see it like that, but more as historical fiction for my family. What do you think, Madhur? So these two questions have to do with voice.
Oh, goodness. So for the first question, it is such a good question. And frankly, it was my fear of losing my mother's diction, losing my mother's voice, and losing my mother's stories. that propelled me to write the book. But in terms of trying to get it back, I mean, in many ways, because like even when I, you know, there's still a lot lost, you know, in a sense, because my mother's telling me these stories now, you know, and well, she told me them over the past few years that I was interviewing her. They're already, I already have trouble getting the voice of her as a child, for example, right? So there's already voices that are lost, and frankly, because they are voices of a time and a place and a culture that was so foreign to me. I also had to reconstruct them. So at least because I was reconstructing her entire life. So what I did, and I don't know if this will work for you, but I hope there's some I hope there's some hope for that for you, was I in fact looked to poetry and fiction written by writers of her time, of that time, if that makes sense. So I found my mother's voice because, for example, I tried to imagine what my mother's voice was like as a young girl in Pakistan, which is now Pakistan, which wasn't then. I tried to imagine her voice as a young woman, you know, trying to get her education in India. I was a budding feminist in that culture. I tried to hear that voice, which was really hard. And what I did was I read novels. I'm looking around because they're still all in my office here, of people who wrote about those types of characters. So my mother became a character in that sense. And I looked for her character in poetry and fiction, and I found it, which was the most amazing thing. I found the things to fill in the gaps. And that's the beauty of literature. So I don't know if that would help you, but that might be one approach. And I listen to others. Yeah, go on.
There's a related question from Val. She says, would you say you gained a new understanding of your parents having listened and written so intimately about their stories? And did they gain a new understanding of you?
I don't know if they gained a new understanding of me. I feel my parents think they know me already very well. I am their daughter. It's a very different relationship. It's a very asymmetric relationship, in fact. The relationship of child to parent and parent to child. You know, my mother hasn't read the whole book. I don't think my father has actually read the whole book yet either. For a variety of reasons, mostly because I just they don't read books like this, and maybe they don't have time to know. Unfortunately, my mother is really ill now, and she can barely speak and walk now, and so she can't read. She can't read it now. Even if she wanted to. My father's her caregiver, and he doesn't have time to. So anyway, all to say that I don't know how much understanding they'll be gaining of me through this, but certainly I gained an understanding. Now, it's one thing but I think I gained a lot of more understanding of myself, if that makes any sense, which was the discovery that, one makes in these processes, because their stories became my stories became their stories. And so I would say it was more along those lines. I feel like there was a second question that I didn't answer somewhere in there.
I think you covered both questions. So thank you for that response. And I'm sorry about your mom's poor health right now. I've got two related questions that have to do with the practical side of writing. One of them has to do with it's more about your opinion. How much does commerce weigh on your art, says Melissa? Do you feel the need to write more commercial projects, or do you feel like poetry and memoir are an escape? And Brenda has a related question. She's thinking of writing. She has written some work and is looking into publication. A lot of the writing came from her journey of sudden widowhood at age 52, and she says she's 72 now. But she is interested in publishing and sharing so that other young widows can learn from her experience. So, how does she do that? So, both Lorna and Madhur could answer that question.
Well, poetry and commercialization have absolutely nothing to do with one another. If you want to make a living as a writer, don't be a poet. That's the first thing I would tell you. I told my students in the writing department at the University of Victoria that they should fall in love with an orthodontist who likes literature, because they weren't going to make enough money to pay a month's rent from publishing a book of poetry. So you write it because you have a calling. You write it because you love it. You write it because you're happier writing poetry than when you're not writing poetry. You write it because poetry gives you a different way of seeing and being in the world. It shines a light on things, a luminosity, because you're looking at them with the attention a poet has to bring to what's going on around us, whether it be a hummingbird coming to the theater, a theater, or the way the soil smells in the spring when you dig your hands into it, to all the wonderful theorems and theories that Madura explores and brings science and language, the language of poetry together. But you don't write poetry to publish. I God bless my publisher for sticking with me since 1985. And I publish a poetry book almost every 3 years. They don't bang on my door saying, "Where's your next poetry book?" I tentatively say to them, "I think I have another book ready, and I hope they'll accept it." I mean, if you could see our royalty checks, it's a joke. It's a sad joke. So, and I didn't write a memoir because I thought I would make more money writing a memoir. I wrote a memoir because I was compelled to do it, because there was something I needed to say that I hoped had value and was a tribute to love, to poetry, to animals, to gardens, to the environment, and the environment of two people dedicated to each other. But whether I'll make any money from it is another question altogether.
That's a wonderful response. Thank you, Lorna. Madhur, do you have a single point that you could offer someone seeking to publish? Is there something that you could tell them that they should do as the first step?
Besides not write poetry.
Besides not write poetry.
It's sad to say. It really is sad to say, but you don't really realize it until maybe after. But you know, if you can find a way to not write, that's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah.
I mean, because I think so many of us, I don't know, it's really hard. It's really hard. It's really, really hard. I mean, I would never say that I, wish I never was a writer. I love that window and view, and I mean, I love the life of a writer. I love that I've been given that. I don't know, that I'm the vessel for that, and that's part of my life. But there are many days, many times when I think, I wish I didn't have that, have to carry this around with me everywhere I go, all day long, all night long, with everything, because then your entire view is shaped by it. And I mean, it's a beautiful thing, but it's also a complicated thing. But that's for the more practical side of publishing. I mean, eventually it happens. I mean, it will happen eventually, I'd like to think. But you have to keep at it. You just have to not give up and keep at it, and seek ways to improve your craft and work on your craft, which is a very, easier said than done. But there are ways to do it, because you can't see the deficiencies yourself all the time. And you can't see the way to get to the next level. You just, if you did, you would be there. So there are many, many tricks. I can't recall the specific question of, you know, which barrier this writer was facing. But there, you know, when I started out, um, it was evident to me the things that I needed to do to improve my writing. And a lot of it was things I could do myself, which was read good books. Sounds so it's trivial, but it's so important. And to this very day, I take that advice for myself. I read good books. Now I read them more so because I want to, but certainly I pay attention to the craft and I learn a lot from good books. And good, you can define good however you want to, because you are the one writing what you want to write. But books that you know, you could learn a lot that way. And I also took workshops, you know, quite a few workshops, and I'm still tempted to, and I still do even now, because there's always something to help you get to the next level of what you're doing. I hope that's an answer to the question.
Thank you. While I have you, Karen's just reminded me about her ghostwriter question. She didn't feel she was a ghostwriter, so my apologies to Karen for forgetting her question.
Yes, I knew there was something. It was a very interesting question.
She said she didn't feel like a ghostwriter, but
no, I mean I ghostwriter. I'm not even sure. You know, I think, you know, in my case, it wasn't my parents did not say to me, write a book about our lives. They never said that, and they never. I mean, they never told me to do that. So I think that's what a ghostwriter would do, right? They would tell a story on because someone has asked them to do it. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But and so yet, of course, they knew what I was doing. So and they were okay with it. They were fine with it. I think they were puzzled. They were just truly puzzled by, you know, why would people want to hear about these stories, and why would you want to write a book about that? But they didn't know. They didn't really know me. You know, they didn't know what I was going to do with those stories. And maybe they still don't quite realize what I've done with the stories. But anyway, all to say that I don't think there's any sort of ethical, I mean, there might be some definitions that you might want to look up, but I don't think there's any sort of ethical issues of writing stories. You know, but if you're going to be writing someone else's story, certainly they need to know you're doing it, and you have to sort of establish your own parameters around that, and the ethics of that. I hope that answers it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. I think we have about 2 minutes, and this is a really quick one. Do you have a favorite memoirist, Madhur?
Favorite memoirist. Lorna, can you go first?
Well, I mean, to sort of follow up very quickly on what you said about you need to read if you want to be a writer. And when I was writing this, I was reading memoirs. The wonderful one by Joan Didion, The Year of Dangerous Thinking. I had read that years ago, and then I reread it. C.S. Lewis's wonderful book about grief. My brain's drawing a blank now. I've read several others, but I can't remember the titles. I'm like Memoir. I'm looking at my bookshelves over here saying, can I pull them off the shelves?
I just recently cleaned out my office. I cleared out, I don't know, there was a table here. That table there must have been 100 books on that table about a week ago, but I just cleared my desk because I want to make space for another project. But
we're getting tired. We're getting tired. We've been here over an hour.
I know. Well, I never answer this question well. I never answer
no,
this
me
question
neither.
well.
Me neither.
But let me just quickly see what I can do here.
When Breath Becomes Air by that wonderful neurosurgeon who died of brain cancer. That was another, I can't remember his name now, another wonderful memoir I read. And then there were Stars, about a couple who lost their 2-year-old baby when part of a New York building fell on his head. Gorgeously written book about grief and loss. Do you want me to keep going?
No, yeah, I have a couple on my shelf. I'm going to show you a couple.
Good.
Lorna, while Mother's looking through her shelf, do you have anything you can tell someone like Brenda who's just looking
thank God I
to
didn't clear
reach
it all out.
out to an audience that might benefit from her kind of experience? Brenda was the one who wanted to reach out to young widows with a book. Is there any one channel of publication you think she could try?
I'm sorry, I really don't know how to answer that question. I think what she should do is partly what Madhur said, find someone she can share the writing with, find someone who will help her make it the best it can be. And there are all kinds of programs in libraries, writers in residence, that are being done virtually now. Reach out to other writers who will help her with that project. And when it's the best it can be, then I would start thinking about publishing it. I don't think the first thing on top of a writer's head is the publishing. I think it's to make it the best work it can be.
Absolutely.
And then you seek a publisher.
That makes complete sense. Mother, did you find your title?
Oh gosh, you know what? I'm going to pass. I'm going to pass on that question.
I think that was a very, very long session and very taxing for both of you. And I'm so delighted with how many questions you were able to answer and how beautifully people participated. And, the comments, ones that are not questions, are so rich in praise and admiration and a sense of the inspiration people have derived from this session. So huge thanks to Lorna Crozier and Madhur Anand for sharing their ideas about their own writing. And thanks to Josh Lambier, the artistic director of Words Fest. And thanks to all of you who attended and made this session really exciting for all of us. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you to you, Vidya. You read the work so carefully and thoughtfully, and it really showed in your questions and your moderation. Thanks. Madhur, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you too, Lorna.
Yeah.
Take care.
You too.
Josh needs to do something.